Welcome to the Mike and Doug Show. I'm Doug. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Doug.
Wow. Your last article left a blazing trail through the sky like a lightning bolt. 11.4 million downloads of the PDF. In other words, it seems as if the accumulative work that you, and of course, I take some claim for it because I talk with you as you're doing the work and talk with your miners. The work that we have been doing has paid off to the point that this seems to be the icing on the cake. And so I've gone back and reviewed what was so amazing about that article. Now, previously, you've gotten millions of hits on articles that you have written with the writers at Americans for Innovation and, of course, channeled through Aim for Truth. But what was special about this? What was it that got people so excited that they made PDF copies of it, not just hits? We're talking about people who had to have a copy of this. Now, when you first showed this to me, the great work of the staff writers and your miners and all this, I said, this is magnificent. This needs to be made into a
Really?
book. Remember, I said, this has to be a book. This is the best thing. It's like absolutely the penultimate expression of everything that has been researched now for a couple of years. But today we're going to try to analyze exactly what it was. What was the approach? What was the view? What was the perspective that caused so many people to get so excited about this? And as we know, every time that you go out on the internet now, you're finding people talking about the Babylonian Radonites. Well, in your recent article, you pointed out that the Radnites are literally the people who controlled all of England, these Rad Knights or Rud Knights. And then it seems that it also connected to basically mercantile banking, the Mercers of the City of London, the entire banking system created by the Templars, which was again, uh, basically they were knights. The Templars were holy knights. They were monks, and they usually traveled in two, just like these rad knights traveled in two. And so today we're going to talk about that, and it won't be too much of a shock to those who have been listening to find out that yes, of course, the research continued and got deeper, but now perhaps it's like a telescope that just came into perfect focus and people just looked at it and said, this is it. We have to copy this and we have to send it to everybody. So what can you tell us about the new research in this specific article, which will of course be listed below, that was the new aspects or just how it was presented in a way that it was so palatable to people that they just went crazy for it?
I think that's probably it. I think that we've been iterating to this moment, and I think the reason it got so much interest is it finally explained what the City of London is and how it relates to world history. And up until then, we had never actually focused on that. We could see that the city, through the bankers, has enormous influence and has had enormous influence. But what we had not done was take it back to its origins. And when you mentioned, for example, the Knights Templar, the City of London predates them. And as you mentioned, the Radnites, the reference to Rodanites from Babylon was a reference to a very seminal history of the Silk Road trade routes that was written by an Arab geographer by the name of Cordoba in the 8th century. And in that, he identified this area of Babylon called Rodan, which I think very closely resembles the City of London. And in fact, the City of London probably copied the patterns of merchant banking from Rodin in Babylon in the way it organized itself right as England was forming itself as a separate country. They had the kingdoms, Wessex Kingdom, the East Anglia Kingdom. They had all these kingdoms and all these kings vying for position, and those were all related to various invasions by the Swedes, by the the Danes, and as they were getting consolidated around King Alfred, which was um, about I can't remember his date, about 50 to 60 years before William the Conqueror, they were already referencing in their histories these rad knights, Radknights, and they had other names as well, but they all tended to start with the R-A-N or R-A-D or R-A-N. And anyway, these were essentially merchant bankers who were attaching themselves uh, from the Silk Road to the various kingdoms and the barons and the earls of the newly forming English country. And they had already taken, under King Alfred, for example, they had already regularized coinage. And then as they moved forward, and William the Conqueror took England at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, we see he had ordered immediately an inventory of all lands under his new rule so that he could tax them. And in the process, they defined the Domesday Book, which was an entire inventory of all of the economy of the British Isles, most of the British Isles. Uh, I mean, the main area, not Scotland, Wales, or Ireland. But in doing that, they identify many times that these Radnites were either the landowners themselves or they were attached to the barons and handled all their business, including tax collection, enforcement of property rights, and the like. And doesn't that sound very familiar with the merchant bankers today? And in fact, I think it is. I think this is where they got their beginnings in the English-speaking world, was through this set of events. Now, why are we talking about the city of London? Because in 1066, on December 25th of 1066, William the Conqueror was crowned king at Westminster Abbey, where the current King George III was also crowned. And in doing so, he began this country of England, this kingdom of England. And then he immediately ordered this inventory. And one of the first things he did was he chartered the city of London. And it was a 1 square mile area in London. London wasn't even the major city of England at the time. That was Winchester. And so England was a trading post for the merchants, the sea merchants who could sail up the Thames and offload their cargo from all over the world in London. And he gave them a special charter, which was issued in 1067. So just within months of his coronation, he did that. And in doing so, he made the city of London a separate legal entity that wasn't London. It was specifically chartered to handle the merchant banking of the kingdom as they went forward. And if you look at the City of London's records, you see that they kept meticulous records of everyone that was a Lord Mayor of London, going all the way back to 1067, and or a Sheriff of London. So they have these two complete sets of records that go back, how many years is that? Over 1,000 years. Now, how many records of any kind of historical body can you see that level of meticulous detail? And one of the reasons they're doing that is because the decisions of the City of London drive the legal environment today. And in fact, the Book of Domes, which occurred subsequently, is still used in settling property rights all over the British Isles. So here we have this entity that was Babylonian Radonite in origin, very clearly. They didn't even change the name, hardly changed anything about them. And these guys traveled with William the Conqueror to England to supplement they're people that were the Radnites who were already in England, and they just carried on their business, their merchant banking to this day. And by the way, they're not English, they're not Christian, they weren't Jewish. They were Babylonian Radonites who just happened to assume a moniker of Judaism because it was good for business later on, called Ashkenazi.
Yes, and the people used to call it the Doomsday Book, but the proper pronunciation is what you're saying, Domesday Book. That was basically an audit. It was an audit
Mm-hmm.
for a Norman king who was taking over the British Isle.
Norman meaning French. A lot of people
Yes,
don't know that.
exactly. And basically, it was a person saying, I'm going to allow you merchants or mercers in the city of London to pass down your wealth from yourself to your children in the same kind of lineage that the monarchy had. But he
Yeah.
also said, I will also pass down the monarchy from myself, William the Conqueror, to my children. And so I'm going to make sure to instate that. In other words, I am taking over Britain, and though I'm a Norman, and there were lots of Britons and Celts and Picts and Scots and all kinds of people had gone over to Normandy, but that wasn't what was happening. This wasn't a British takeover of the British Islands. This was a French Norman. And when you say Norman, you're also saying that the Vikings had mixed with the French. So you're talking about barbarians who came over and said, we're taking over, but we are going to create a special protected class called the Mercers. In other words, well, in essence, merchant bankers and merchants who are selling, who have specific rights granted to them and their families to continue to have control over the kingdom economically. And so when you're looking at the Domesday Book, you're looking at simply these Radonites who did an audit of England and basically said, we're taking it all, but we're going to allow the merchant class, particularly merchant bankers, particularly Babylonian Radonites, to rule the city of London, which is quite separate from London itself or the rest of the kingdom that was known as Britain, or the basically at that time being ruled by previously by Anglo-Saxons, which again are not British, they are not Celtic, they are not Britons, they are in fact warring Viking tribes.
Right.
So you have a replication in the city of London of what happened in Babylon with the fake Jews who were at some point perhaps Hebrew, but that could have been 1,000 years before. So what we have is a little section of Babylon set aside for these merchant bankers, for these mercers, for these merchants who trade with the sword, for the people who control the taxes, for the people who control land management, and put people in jail for usury and not being able to pay the interest on loans and or the interest on their land. And so you have this, when you and the miners discovered this, it absolutely blew my mind. I have a degree in British history, and I never once ever heard of Rad Knights or Rudd Knights. And that sounds exactly like the word Rad Knight, the Babylonian Rad Knight. So I'm thinking, what is this? Was this obfuscation? Was this to hide the fact? And then you pull up a quote, who was it, Disraeli or whoever it was, that said, the
Yeah.
city of London is Babylon. I
Right.
mean, they point blank knew that this was what was going on. And they point blank knew they gave their country away to a person who was not an Anglo-Saxon, not a Brit, not a Celt. No, they gave it away to the most ruthless barbarians. And then they made a deal with the merchant bankers. And to this very day, these are the people who control the US Federal Reserve, our largest banks here in America, and basically the largest banks throughout the world. So
Correct.
this is a 4,000-year-old institution that has been literally obfuscating so well that if you said to even someone in England, well, you know how your old tax collectors, the Radnites, did it with two knights who would go around, one with a sword and the other one with a book, and you either paid your taxes or you either went to jail or you were incarcerated, you were punished by the sword. And I'd say, that's crazy. That didn't
Mhm.
happen. No, it did happen.
It did
And I
happen.
think that might be the shock that really got to people.
I think you're right. Because I lived in England and I'd never heard of anything like that. And so what we see here is a criminal. I say it's criminal obfuscation of history to make sure that there was no awareness in the world of this millennia long strategy of the merchant bankers to make sure that they seized control of the whole world. And that led us to this additional revelation that because these people were pagan Babylonians, then we needed to look at who were they worshiping, and because they're just pretending to be Jewish, and in fact, we have some today that are pretending to be Christian, but we'll deal with that at another time. So what our Babylonian Radhanites today are doing is practicing that um, uh, age-old philosophy of Sabbates V and Jacob Frank, who was closely associated with the Rothschilds. And the admonition was just pretend to be whatever religion in the country is that you are living, but anciently you're going to practice our paganism, and that paganism comes out of demonic worship of Moloch, um, Asmodeus, Aramon. Uh, who else, Douglas?
Mammon,
Mammon.
Baal, and just a host of others. And that was also in the article a real explicit list of the demons that have been worshipped by these merchant bankers, by
Right.
these merchants.
And still are today. And so once you see this thread and get this thread, other things that people have always talked about related to the cultic practices of, for example, Freemasonry, start to make sense because we see that these people, these red knight bankers, long ago took control of Solomon's gold and used that to lever all the financials in the world and applied it to merchant banking. Well, it obviously makes sense. They're not going to ever give up that power, and they haven't. And it's a demonic power that is so slowly pulling our cultures down. And it's about time we recognize that we're dealing with a demon here. We're not dealing with human beings who could not possibly organize this over 4,000 years. This has to be a demon.
Absolutely. And I think that our audience has got to the point that it's kind of like when Rudolf Steiner will start off, he'll say, well, as you know, and then he'll make this sentence. And well, most people have no idea what any of those words even mean, but he'll say, as you know. So we can now say, as you know, there is no Khazarian mafia. There are Ashkenazi Jews who have been around calling themselves Ashkenazi Jews, who literally worked with the Roman trade routes. So when you're talking about the Normans who went over to take over Britain, that at that point was well over 1,000-year old institution that had was pervasive throughout France, throughout
Right.
Germany, even into Spain, in Italy. So we have what we know, what people are referring to as Ashkenazi Jews, but they're not Ashkenazi Jews, and they're not Jews, and they're probably so little Hebrew that it would be insulting to call
First of
them.
all, Ashkenaz was never a tribe of Israel. And all of a sudden, we've got this made up name that appeared at about the same time as William the Conqueror and the seizing of England in 1066. And you mentioned Khazarian. Well, by that time, these guys had used Khazaria as a trade route to replace the one that the Arabs had trade route for the Silk Road that the Arabs had blocked that was moving into Babylon and started a new trade route over Khazaria. And they talked the Khazarians historically to convert to Judaism. I think that was never an issue. That was just a good banking a move so that they could say they were something other than pagans. And so that's why the Khazarian um, identity arose, and it's legit. They were there, they were a part of this, but the idea that they were a mafia and that the entire country had converted to Judaism is there's no history that really proves that. But what we do see is their leaders and their bankers definitely claim to be Jewish, and so they had their money, they had their hand out, and their change pockets moving for about 200 years before England was created. The Babylonian Radhanites moved into the city of London, and then all of a sudden the Khazarians were no longer needed because they could use the British ships going forward as another route to China. And so that's what happened. So all of a sudden, we see these historians just start ignoring a discussion of the Radhanites and saying the Ashkenazi Jews appeared, Yiddish appeared. They were all embracing the Talmud, which had been created in Babylon. And we now see what was going on here. There was an entire storyline, a narrative, if you like the current name for a lie, historically, to really confuse the world as to who was controlling the merchant banking trade routes of the world and what their motives were. And we can see now the motive is a demonic motive, has nothing to do with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or anything else. We're being attacked by a demon called Mammon and Lucifer and the list that you just mentioned. That's who we're fighting. And here we see a reference in Revelation in chapters 2 and chapters 3. And we see multiple revelations to this reference to the synagogue of Satan, where people pretend to be Jews, but they're not. And so I think the writers of the Bible, the apostles, Jesus, were all very familiar with these Babylonian bankers. And that's why they were making these references. And Jesus said specifically, you cannot serve Mammon and serve God. And Mammon was specifically the chief god of the Babylonian merchant bankers. So what do we need? We've got plenty of evidence that the watershed moment at the coming of Christ that really pointed out to us this demon that we have now been fighting ever since then.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt. And when you look at demons, the number 1 and number 2 books are the Lesser and Greater Keys of Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at them, they are demon worship. They are devil worship. They even give the specific sigils, the symbols for these devils. And remember that Solomon, with all of his wives, set up temples for each of those wives that believed in one of these demons. And so when you say demons, you might as well say Solomon. So when you are told that Solomon was the wisest man on the earth, you need to back up a little bit. There's also other books supposedly attributed to Solomon, and they are grimoires. They are demon-worshiping books. That's what they are. And they were attributed to Solomon. So
we had people last week looking at the liturgy for the coronation of King George III. And wouldn't you know it, there were 4 references to Solomon in that, I forget how many pages it was, a 40-page book. I mean, you never see that in a liturgy. And yet they wanted to make sure that we were quite aware of King Solomon before he started worshiping all the gods of his 1,000 wives and concubines. So Solomon did not end well. And what he taught us is that if you fall to the demon of Mammon, you will fall into a pit of hell.
It's so hidden. It's so purposefully hidden from people, obfuscated, we can call it, that when you say the Star of David, guess what? The Star of David has nothing to do with David. The Star of David has nothing to do with the Hebrews. And though it's a symbol of the Jewish people these days, supposed Jewish people, no, go back to its original source. It was called the Star, and that star was referring to the planet Saturn. So when you see the 6-pointed star, you are looking at the demon of this earth, Baal or Bel or Ahriman or Mephistopheles, call him whatever you want. It's the demon of the earth. It's the demon of Saturn, the demon of death. And what was King Solomon's ring? A six-pointed star. It had nothing to do with the fact that today it is used as a symbol for Jews, when in fact there is no historical substantiation of that, except to go back to the lesser and greater seals of Solomon, which show the symbols for all the demons and devils, because why? Solomon was worshiping all of them.
He was.
And so it's just an absolute absurdity that we then think, and people try to say, well, the Jews, there was the diaspora, and that they were basically merchants who were along all of the Roman trade routes. No, they were there long before the Romans. The Romans came in 747 BC. They were there 1,000 years before that.
Right. Yeah, and so we see in 600 BC, we see archaeological evidence now proving that whoever these people were, and we believe they were pagan Babylonian Radonites who claimed to be Jewish, they were very clear about what their priorities were. They even sealed all their contracts in these jars, which they dug up in the last 100 years. And we see meticulous detail. These people were using banking as a mechanism for making sure that their families lived in splendor for their entire generations and many after that. And we see records of 3 or 4 or 5 generations of those bankers. And they were no more Jewish than a man in the moon, but they claimed to be. And so what we have been subjected to is an absolute travesty of scholarship by our historians, who should have figured this out, should have known this. But I think because of the money that these Ravnites were feeding to academia, they kept silent, or they didn't write about it, or if they did write about it, they confused people to the point where nobody wanted to follow it up. And now, thankfully, to the internet and some of the technology related to social networking, we've been able to get access to a lot of these documents that were previously stored or hidden in museums, in libraries, and in archaeological records that have enabled us to be able to put this story together.
And to me, William the Conqueror is just another marauding Viking. And Viking is not specifically Swedish or Norway or Jutland or the Picts or the Celts no, they were basically barbarians. They were basically non-Christian, pagan worshiping tribes that essentially moved in and took over where the Roman government in Britain started to wane. And so with the Romans, of course, they were barbarians themselves. If you look at the way that they conquered the world ruthlessly, and who did they use to conquer it? They weren't Romans. Most of their leaders were not Romans. They were people who were taken from the outside of the barber, beyond the fence, beyond the wall. And they were, in fact, for instance, King Arthur. There was no King Arthur, but there was Arthur, the Roman general, who was the son of Pendragon, because the dragon is the symbol of the Romans. So when you're talking about the Romans in Britain, when you have the Anglo-Saxons, the Picts, the Jutes, all of the invaders coming in, they tried to replicate what the Romans were doing, but the Romans already had what was later in Europe called their own court Jews. They already had the merchant class who did their dirty work for them. And so you can see both in Normandy, in Gaul, in France and Germany, in Britain, Scotland, Ireland, the same exact thing happened that was happening with the Romans. The Romans would set up a manor house, and the manor house would be basically then later turned into a fort. And then it would be turned into a baronship, or there would be a carl, there would be a lord of that manor house, or
the lord of the manor.
And later that became a city. And then, of course, that's where the Templars and others, particularly the merchant bankers, set up their banks protected by the walled city. And then who was it that went out beyond the wall? And that was the people who had basically taken their fealty oath to the Carl, to the Baron, to the king, and they had knights. The entire thing was based upon land, and the land then had to produce knights, and these were called rad knights,
Right.
R-A-D, knights, K-N-I-G-H-T. They weren't, but who were they? They were doing the exact same thing that the Ijibi and the Marushu were doing in Babylon, in Radon, the Radnites. It is the same exact program.
Absolutely.
And then
Absolutely.
later, the Templars came along and followed that exact model. The only difference was they took their oath to the Roman Catholic Pope, but they did the same thing. They were basically collecting taxes and keeping the roads open all the way from Europe, even from Ireland, all the way to Jerusalem. Same exact thing that the Babylonian Radnites were doing with the Silk Road, which was transformed into much later Roman roads, and then the Roman merchants. The Romans didn't do merchandising. They had these Babylonian Radnites doing it.
Right.
So one could almost say that the Templar banks, if you plug in a query for banks, one of the first things that's going to come up is the Templars.
Right.
Well, who did the Templars build their two knights per horse? And those two knights did what? They were doing the bidding of the king, the Carl, the Baron, and basically then that became literally turned into the cities of all of Europe and Britain, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and nothing changed. Nothing changed. It was still
Well,
the same people collecting the taxes, the same people holding a sword over people who didn't pay their taxes on their land, the same people who would give their fealty to the Lord. And then the Lord, those guys never stopped warring on each other. The history of Britain is a history of brutal tribal warlords killing each
let
other.
me give you a couple little factoids here. 1066, Britain is taken by William the Conqueror. By 1090, these bankers were financing British knights to head off to Jerusalem in the First Crusade, just within a few decades. And so here we have these Radonites, these Radnites, bankers uh, sending knights from England off to Jerusalem. Now, at that time, Jerusalem was conquered by the Seljuk Turks. And so you can see what's going on here. These Babylonian Radonites wanted Babylon back, and so they were going to use these Christian knights to try to accomplish that. They attempted, there were 8 crusades to try to get that accomplished, and they failed. And I think that's when the City of London really emerged as the ultimate banking center, when they realized that Babylon was never coming back to them.
And as you have suggested, and I have to agree, what were they really trying to do with the Crusades? Get back the power they had
Right.
in Babylon, in the Radnites had in Babylon, and basically Israel was incidental because by that time they weren't a power at all. They were nothing. The Seljuk Turks, as well as the Romans before them, they had taken over those lands and they were no longer a power. As a matter of fact, we have pointed out and would love for someone to demonstrate that what we've said is not true, that the tremendous amounts of gold that Solomon had were never turned into coins.
No.
So what were they used for? The only thing we can assume is they went to Radnite in Babylon, and it was used as the assets to back up the merchant bankers.
Yep.
And these bankers, okay, let's remember
Sorry to interrupt, but who were issuing letters of credit all along the Silk Road. So the gold, again, I mean, think of how similar that story is to the Rothschild vaults in London today. That was the purpose of gold. And once they figured that system out of how to issue fiat paper on the backs of a supposed vault of gold, they were off to the races, and they were just going to keep repeating that pattern all over the country. And the additional thing I want to point out is that while they were on the shtick of calling themselves Jews, the other thing they did is invented the idea of pogroms. And what we now know about banking, fiat currency banking, and debt and compound debt is every so often when you've fleeced an entire area of the world with that kind of monetary system, sooner or later your system crashes, and you've got to um, move on. And so what they did is they created a story of the pogroms to justify why they were moving on. And so, we've all been taught this stuff our whole lives. It's taken me probably a decade to uh, realize that nothing I learned in history was true.
Absolutely. And you can already see this happening because the Silk Road goes back to practically, well, the Hammurabi's code. It goes back like 2000
Right.
BC. And there was no
And
war going
probably
on.
before that.
Yes, even before that. There was no war going on because the Sogdians, who had controlled the Silk Road, had their own army. It was bigger than the Persian army and it protected everyone. Every day's ride, there was a fort that the Sogdians, who spoke Sogdian, they were Persian, but they spoke their own language. In other words, the merchant class language. So they were merchants with a sword and they had fortresses. And so they protected everyone on the Silk Road because it was good for business. Well, eventually, the Babylonian Radonites, the fake Jews or the Hebrews, fake Hebrews, took that over and created their own language called Yiddish, and they took over all of that.
Right.
And so by the time the Romans came along, they had their banking plan down pat. Even the Romans wouldn't mess with them. The Romans allowed them to do their business. But here's the new thing. When you got the Vikings involved, or you got the invading Anglo-Saxons, or you got the Norsemen who were invading England, and not only England but all of the continent, Europe, what did they add? War, fomenting war, creating wars, and then having the spoils of wars. Now, do you think that a single Radonite, Babylonian Radonite, ever fought in a war? I can't find a single evidence that a single
Yeah.
one of them ever did that. But once you added the Norman Viking, uh, marauding Vikings, you can call them, I like to call them, because they were basically undefeatable throughout all of Europe and Italy and all the way to Sicily, all the way to the uh, the Holy Roman Empire later, and all the way to, of course, Jerusalem. They were unstoppable. They were undefeatable. Why? Because they were vicious warriors. And so King Charles, King Upchuck, King Charlie the Third, he took an oath upon his arm ring. That is so Viking. There is nothing more Viking than that. And so he, supposedly the defender of the faith, and he took an oath to be a defender of all faiths. In other words, he flushed the the Church of England, the Anglicans, down the toilet when he said he was now the protector of all religions. And in the coronation papers, he gives as much credence to foreign deities, to basically who we would call pagan deities, as he did to Jesus Christ. And literally making reference to Solomon over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
But he literally took a vow upon his arm ring. Well, that's what the Vikings did. And the Vikings believed in one thing mostly, and that's that they needed to die in battle with the sword in their hand. It's the only way they're going to go to their heaven, to Valhalla. It's the only way they're going to be immortal. And so we have King Upchuck taking his vows and using swords from people of the past who were horrifying pagans and horrifying tribal leaders who were pathetically ruthless, even against
King
their own.
George, the sword was from King George the Fourth, the one after King George the Third that we fought in the Revolution. So he was mopping up after the Revolution and was a profligate womanizer, ended up dying of a severe mental illness, and he had turned over the entire management of the post-American Revolution business with America to the City of London, specifically. And
And
that was
those,
after
yep.
that Alexander Hamilton had formed our first four banks, where he essentially sold all the stock to the British.
These are economic warriors. And with William the Conqueror, he said, "You merchant class, you get to pass this on in a direct lineage to your children
Yeah,
forever
that's
and
it.
ever."
I just want to point out that's in a very small charter that's not a very big piece of paper. And that's specifically in there how they're going to handle the succession. And it's going to go from father to son.
Which is exactly what the Radhanite banking families of Marushu and Ijibi, as well as who funded all of the Crusades. Those would be what were called court Jews, who weren't Jews at all. Those would be the court Jews of Venice and the court Jews of, well, let's just call them merchant banking Babylonian Radhanites. They were the people who gave the money to both sides and fomented the wars. So
Right.
the only thing that they added from the old days of the Silk Road was war. And this war was never ending. There's hardly a year in all of British history where there was peace.
Yeah, war it just keeps the property claims churning, and that's good for these bankers.
And as we know with the Templars, the way that they tell the story, and it's always very interesting because now we find out that if you look closely, most of these stories are simply fairy tales. But the way that they say that it worked, the reason that the Templars became bankers and they had such a stash of gold that they deposited in their consistories all across Europe, all the way to Jerusalem, so you could write a check in at Saint Denis in Paris and put some gold in their consistory there. And all along the Crusade Trail, you could cash that check in for gold or for coinage or for money that you could then use to pay for your crusade. But what happened when you died in the crusade? Your
They
money
took
went to the
possession.
bank. It went to the Templars, right? So here's the
Hmm.
Templars protecting the people in the battles to make sure the battles continue, to make sure the wars continue. And they were basically mercenaries because they would oftentimes, for instance, the bankers in Venice, they would provide you with boats, but they wouldn't tell you that the boats had previously been used and with people who had the plague. And many of the people who climbed on a boat in Constantinople or in Venice died on the boat of illness. Matter of fact, more people died of illness in the Crusades than from fighting. Well, they knew that. And so what would they do? They'd get the boat back and sell it again to the next Crusaders. They would fund both sides of the war, and none of those bankers ever picked up a sword and joined the supposed religious crusades. And so now what do we have? We have England, basically, the cowards who won't pick up a sword and go to war. They're in the city of London, and they're mercers and they're bankers and their family are bankers. And so it's again blood lineage, and they
We've
foment
got
war.
America to fight their wars.
Absolutely. And we know they, for instance, in the American Revolution, we weren't even fighting Britons as much as we were fighting mercenaries, German mercenaries. What were they called?
Hessians,
Hessians, yes.
Hessians
And by the way, that's
from
who,
Hesse
and that
or
exactly, which is where
Rothschild.
the Rothschilds, the Bowers, the Bacharachs, the bankers of England, they were those people. Those were mercenaries from those people. And so when you want to look at the war, American Revolution or the Civil War, that was Rothschild backed wars.
Right.
Now, name a great Rothschild who was a general or who ever fought in any war. You can't find one. And so when people tell me, well, just because their dad was evil doesn't mean they're evil. No, incorrect. If you're of one of these banking families, you are pure evil. It doesn't matter whether you go off and you
Well,
collect insects or whatever you say you do, and you have this, art collection, or you're a philanthropist. That is a big fat friggin' lie. Look at Charles, our new king here, and what does he want? He wants to turn climate change into a war. He says we must use a new, what did he say, Monroe Doctrine, or he wants to
Marshall Plan
Marshall Plan.
doctrine.
He wants a new Marshall Plan. In other words, he wants to make it a war. If you do not support his ideas, which are completely insane and stupid, that climate change happens because every 10 years they change the name of it. All my life, it's been every 10 years, they simply change up the name of whatever this war they're on. Why? Because that war makes them money. And so what you have here is war created by banksters, or like I like to
Well,
call them, bankster warlords.
last time I checked, King George III has no experience with environmental engineering.
You mean
And
Charles III?
Charles,
Charles.
what did I say?
George.
I said Charles.
Well, you're still thinking about the
King
sword that he
Charles.
was
Oh,
carrying. The brass
Prince Charles.
sword. One of the swords was a brass sword. It goes all the way back to the time of Arthur, to the Romans, and they are still worshiping the pagan Romans. Yes, they are. They're still worshiping the Vikings. Yes, they are. And he said he would protect all of them. That's the vow he took. And when he kissed that Bible, I wanted to vomit because you just
Well,
could look at him and
we're migrating into the coronation, but the probably the most offensive thing in that was this new addition of a pledge of the citizenry to fealty to the king and his successors. Now that is demonic. You're pledging your king to a you're pledging your fealty to a theoretical successor. That is so demonic.
we know Harry is not even King Charles III's son. I doubt whether William was either, because basically Diana, his first wife, and he were estranged from the first moment that they got married. I don't know that they ever had any children. So here you are taking a vow of fealty to William and Harry and the rest of the Holy Family. That would be Andrew. And of course, they're Holy Family because they're the head of their own church, just like King Henry VIII, who was nothing but a whoremonger. Well, what is King Charles III? A whoremonger. The entire time he was with Diana, he was having an affair with his queen consort, as we now call her. I think if I was a Briton, I would be so insulted to have to call her the queen because she's nothing more than a whore. And to give her any credence whatsoever, but then to give Charles any credence. I mean, Charles, look at his history. We've already demonstrated who the guy is.
So we're looking at now a veneer of Christianity with an under layer of Babylonian Radhanite paganism, and these people have been very successful at using their money to keep up this shtick for what hundreds or thousands of years, and now we're starting to see how this system works, and I think that's what we want to achieve is really understanding who it is that we're addressing and dealing with, and clearly we're not dealing with human beings here. These people are as much a victim of this demon as the rest of us are. uh, the difference, as you have pointed out many times, is they chose to follow that demon, and I haven't, and I don't want to, and I don't want my children to, or my society. And that's really where we've got to go now. We have to start kicking these demons out.
Well, as they'll tell you, the oldest institutions in the world are prostitution first, and in this order, tax, and the Vatican. Well, that's incorrect. The oldest institution are the Babylonian Radnites. They are these merchant bankers who had the laws of Hammurabi to support them, to basically trick people into loaning them money with interest rates called usury, and then putting them in jail when they couldn't pay. And then when they couldn't work their way out of jail, they put their wife in jail and their children in jail. They seized their
Not
land.
jail, slavery.
Total slavery. And they had to work the whole time, complete slavery. They worked them to death. And very few people ever came out of debt slavery in Babylon. Because why? It was intended that way. And so when you say now, let's see, Silicon Valley Bank, it went belly up, First Republic went belly up, and now we are being told JP Morgan swooped in and bought up the bank. That is a big fat lie. No, they did not. The FDIC gave them $50 billion to come in to subsume their assets, not pay their debts, and JP Morgan made out as bandits taking tax money. And who is JP Morgan? Anything but American. They
JP
are
Morgan,
British.
Its root is the Manhattan Bank, which was started in 1799. And JP Morgan was the eventual inheritor of that bank, Chase Manhattan. And so we see the four banks that the trader Alexander Hamilton started and got the British to fund, not the British, the Babylonian Radhanites to fund out of the city of London. The British didn't fund that; the city of London funded that, and that's the set of banks that we're dealing with today. And I will say that we've got people working on Jamie Dimon's history, and they've just discovered that he was schooled and groomed in a particular school in New York that was overrun with Pilgrim Society members. So he's clearly another groom. He inherited his banking practices from his grandfather, who came from Smyrna, Turkey. Now, where have you heard Smyrna, Turkey before? That happens to be where the opium trade of the 1800s was pushed out of London through the Boston Brahmins in this country, to and fro from the west to China. And then on the way back, they would load up those ships from America with slaves from Africa, because the British had on paper abolished slavery at the same time as they set up offshore banking accounts. So Jamie is doing nothing but carrying on the Babylonian Radhanite tradition.
And they're so good without the help of you and the miners naming these banks where they came from. You would have no idea. If
Yeah,
you look at the name of the bank, you cannot figure it out unless you have some astounding research behind you.
in this century, in the last century, the banks changed names. They just rotated names after the formation of the Pilgrim Society and the move into American banking. They just kept rotating the names so that you would get confused. Anybody would get confused reading. Well, this bank became that bank, and then that bank merged with that bank, and then that bank over there came over here, and they changed their name to the previous bank that had just failed. And then we came, and you get messed up. And for the longest time, we all were too. But now we can see that this was to keep us people on Main Street confused as to what they were doing. And then the most recent thing, Douglas, that our people discovered is that his grandfather's banking activity in New York is certainly related to the Baccarat family. There's four brothers of the Baccarat family that came and were quite involved with multiple banks in New York. And who were the Baccarats? That was the original name of the Rothschilds before 1750. So the Rothschilds moved in these stealth players called the Baccarats, and one of those, I can't remember which one it was, Isaac, I think it was Isaac Baccarat, was a representative in New Jersey, and he is the one that proposed eminent domain and got passed eminent domain in this country so that the government could seize assets whenever they wanted to. How
Absolutely.
much more do you need to know?
And they just changed the names. Like, for instance, the Bacharachs came from the city Baruch, and Baruch was a Roman trading. It was actually a section of a town where only the Radhanite Babylonians lived, and then they just assume one name after the next. First it's Baruch, then it's Bacharach, and then it's Bauer, and then it's Rothschild. And then it's J.P. Morgan, who their agents, and pretty soon it's their agents. And so people say, "Oh, the Rothschilds, blah blah blah, Illuminati, this and that, and this and that." And no, you need to be specific about these things. These people have been obfuscating their personal history for
Yes,
4,000 years, and
correct.
when you find out the history, it basically comes down to a very small group of either bankster families or merchant families. For instance, the British East India Company was subsumed by the British nation, but at one point, the British East India Company was a stock holding company that a few lords in England were part of. But basically, they were just outright criminals. They even hid the fact that they might be a member of the British East India Company board. And then you look closely, and what do you find out? They then became the Foreign Service. They then became
Yeah,
that's the Navy.
the
That's their
British
army.
the British East India Company was facilitating the trading of the Levant Company. And the Levant Company was started in the 1700s specifically to trade in opium and slaves throughout the known world. And when we just double check this, the Levant Company was officially dechartered in 1824. And so you think, okay, well, they were done with that. But no, if you look at the parliamentary records, all they did was turn all that business over to the British Foreign Office. And so all the way through the 1800s, the British Foreign Office was facilitating slave trading and opium and pushed two wars against the Chinese to get the Chinese to buy the opium from Turkey, which came out through Smyrna, where Jamie Dimon's granddad was born, to the west. So what we're seeing is the same old story, and that Jamie, who is Greek and has a very Christian last name, according to their legend, his grandfather changed the name to Diamond from Papa Demetriou, who was named after a third century pope from Alexandria. And so he has a Christian name, Christian background. And
So
so here we have it's not just associated with Jews.
absolutely. And to take Cecil Rhodes, who you could say was one of the grandfathers of the Pilgrim Society. And by the way, the head of the Pilgrim Society now is King Charles III. And so
Yep,
we are not just shooting turkeys here. These are the realities that are controlling our world at this very moment. Nothing has changed. It's the same people, same bloodlines. So when you look at the British East India Company, basically you'd have to say the battle between the German Hanseatic League, the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. Eventually, the Dutch and the British were fighting over America. That's what the American Revolution was,
right,
period. The British won, and we did not win the American Revolution. That is noted by the fact that you have pointed out that all of the original banks, the national banks in America, were all British sponsored, British money, British controlled. And to this very day, the US Federal Reserve is still owned by banksters who are generally part of these banking lineage families.
right,
Nothing has changed in 4,000 years.
right. Yeah, the names have changed, and currently, I just heard somebody talk about a list of the top stockholders within the Federal Reserve, and it's all banks that we think are from America. But if you look at the underlying controlling stockholders, it all walks back to the City of London. That is, what's showing up here in our discussion of the formation of the City of London. The evidence is piling up to a huge mound that the City of London is, in fact, the center of all of this evil that we're trying to fight and overcome in this country.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt, and we've now proven it. And basically, we call this truth history. And so, if you've been following along with us for years, we have gently walked you along this path of perdition. We've named the players, we've named the beings who they worship, and the intelligences that actually run these things. Because these aren't human beings anymore.
Right.
These are, as you pointed out, these are demonic intelligences. And so when you're talking about the bank failures that are happening right now, you're talking about Jerome Powell and the Fed, you're talking about Yellen and the US Treasury. I'm sorry, you might as well just say Babylonian Radnites who are crown agents to the British monarchy. And you can see the grotesque nature of this as it was thrown in our face with the coronation, with a man who is supposed to be a holy man, the head of his own religion, who is doing nothing more than Henry VIII did, which is being a whore. And being a whore for money, being a whore for prostitution, being a whore for basically lying, cheating, you name it. And that's what the British monarchy is. And that's why so many of the Brits are upset with this coronation. But I'm upset with the fact that people don't understand that the American banking system is nothing more than a British control system. It is a British crown agent that is controlling America, and debt slavery through usury tax slavery, taxing us for wars that they created, both sides of the war, and they benefited, and they sent none of their children into battle. It's the same old story that's been going on. In other words, there's nothing new under the sun, and basically the devil only is now being openly worshiped, and they're bypassing the fact that all of the deaths of modern wars all come from banksters.
Yeah.
And then now people want to worship Lucifer. They're literally opening clubs in schools for the children to worship Lucifer, and it is now legal to be a Satanist. And the Satanists have more power than the Christians now. It is a very sad thing. But we have to thank you and your miners and your researchers, the people at Americans for Innovation, and Tyla and her team at Aim for Truth, because we're going to just keep pounding on this until basically the nut cracks and people begin to see what it is that's been going on for so many thousands of years. This is demon worship, plain and simple, using money as the tool, using banking as the tool, usury, taxes. And it's a very sad story, but it has to be told.